We're less than a week away from the release of Spider-Man No Way Home. Leading up to this event film, I'm trying to review the older Spider-Man films that I've talked about on my channel, but not fully reviewed. That leads us to Spider-Man 3, so let's talk about it. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies and TV way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comments section. Share your thoughts on Spider-Man 3. My take isn't the right take, it's just my take, and I would love to see yours. Also, this is a spoiler review, so I will be talking spoilers in this review. If you haven't seen Spider-Man 3 yet, go watch it. You'll probably be disappointed. Then come back and watch this video, but we will be talking about spoilers. With that said, let's get started with the production of Spider-Man 3. After the critical and financial success of Spider-Man 2, it was inevitable that we would get a Spider-Man 3. So the creative force came back together to make a third Spider-Man movie, but unfortunately this time around, there was a little bit more trouble behind the scenes, or at least they weren't on the same page. Sam Raimi wanted Harry Osborn as the Green Goblin to fulfill the arc that they'd set up for him in the previous two films. He wanted Sandman and he wanted Vulture, played by Ben Kingsley. But producer Avi Arad really felt they needed to go with Venom, who is a fan favorite, and they just thought that would just please the audience far more so than kind of continuing to pull from the more classic Spider-Man rogues gallery. Venom was a newer creation, and so he was more red hot at the time. That's who he wanted. Sam Raimi has openly stated he doesn't really get the Venom character. He doesn't resonate with him, and he decided to include him just because he was asked to, but he was never fully bought into the character, and the end result was a film that made a ton of money. This movie financially, Spider-Man 3, just as successful, more successful than the previous two films, but the actual reception from the fans was not nearly as good as it was with the previous two films. And Sam Raimi himself has made it pretty clear he does not like this film. In fact, in the Nerdist podcast, he called it awful. And then he also elaborated with his thoughts on it. He said this: "It's a movie that just didn't work very well. I tried to make it work, but I didn't really believe in all the characters, so that couldn't be hidden from people who loved Spider-Man. If the director doesn't love something, it's wrong of them to make it when so many people love it. I think raising the stakes after Spider-Man 2 is the thinking going into it, but I think that's what Doom does. I should have just stuck with the characters and relationships and progressed them into the next step and not tried to top the bar." And that's what led to the statement I actually started with, where he said, "Directors don't like to talk about their bad films." And then the interviewer said, "I don't think the movie's bad." And he goes, "Awful." Calls his own movie awful. And so he's probably exaggerating. He's probably trying to diffuse some of the frustration of fans and make the audience know that he's on the same page with them. He wasn't happy with the end product either, but he's probably overstating that just a little bit. As for me, where do I land on this one? Well, it's a movie that it's complicated to talk about because I feel like almost everything about it kind of falls into the mixed category, where there's like a good idea in there or some good execution, but then there's also some bad ideas and bad execution with everything. And it's never fully just that part was awesome or that part was totally devoid of anything good about it. It's just always this weird mix of everything. And so I'm going to review this movie more topically. Normally I do the good, the mixed, the bad. This one's going to be topical, so you can hop around from whatever subject you want to hear me talk about down below at the chapter markers. And likewise, normally I end with my score, and I'm going to start this one off with my score to just kind of frame where I'm coming from with this film. And I'll just tell you right now, I'm going to give it a C+, 6 out of 10. I think it's a very middle of the road, slightly bad film. I don't think it's a total disaster. I don't think it's awful as Sam Raimi described it, but it is far below the other two films. It has a lot of problems, but I also think it has a lot of good in it as well. And the reason I want to say that is as I go into it, it's a little bit easier to sometimes dissect things and say exactly what didn't work about them. So I'll be talking more negatively than I think I actually feel about the film, because I think it still has some of the spark, the magic of the first two films, while at the same time being all over the place, tackling too many storylines, and having some very goofy, weird ideas inside of it. With that said, let's get started. And the first thing I want to talk about with this movie is that it's simply overcrowded. crowded. As Sam Raimi said in that little interview clip we mentioned before, the idea was going into it that they just wanted to go bigger with everything. So they just wanted to ratchet up all of the stakes. And when that turns into an application is that there's too many main plot lines and there's also too many subplots because they just try to increase everything all at the same time. And so when you look at the movie, there's more villains, there's more threats, there's more relational trouble, there's more love triangles, there's more interpersonal disconnects, there's more betrayals, all of this stuff. There's just more of it added on top of each other. But at a certain point in time, when you're just adding more, you're stealing screen time from something else. It gets so complex, it gets so convoluted, everything's just kind of stacked on top of each other that they're all fighting for screen time. And I think you kind of see that in the movie pretty overtly, where they had to come up with some plot devices as to why all the characters aren't doing things at certain points in time. So the movie very early on introduces Harry as Green Goblin, but then they bonk him on the head. And so that through the middle act, he's not Green Goblin, because if you had Green Goblin attacking Peter the whole movie, you couldn't do all the other stuff they want to do. So he has to get bonked on the head and get temporary amnesia for sake of the plot, so that during the middle act, we can focus in on Sandman a little bit more. So he's the big focus. But then we need to move on the focus to the black symbiote suit Spider-Man and back to Green Goblin. So then Sandman gets literally washed away through about 30 minutes of screen time. There's a point in time where the symbiote is introduced and then just chills at Peter's apartment. Why is all this going on? Because there's too many characters, too much stuff, that you have to find a way to just sideline people in order to focus on the other things. And that's what happens when you cram too much stuff in that doesn't organically go together. Likewise, you're watching the movie, and as soon as Eddie Brock gets the Venom symbiote, it just like almost awkwardly cuts to the third act. Like, he gets it, like, runs around, and then it literally goes to a news broadcast to play catch up on what's been going on for a little bit. And it's like, a bunch of villains have taken over a building. Someone's dangling from it. Oh, Peter better go to the rescue. And it's just very awkwardly done because they're trying to find a way to force all of these different things together at the exact same time. And it's just also, when you have this many plot lines in a single movie, everything gets microwaved. You don't have time to slow cook it. You don't have the time to develop it, do anything properly. You just throw it in the microwave and fly through your storytelling. So at one point in time in the movie, Eddie Brock posts a picture defaming Spider-Man. And so then it's like, pictures posted, Spider-Man, is he a villain? And then in the very next scene, you have Peter Parker shows up and is like, this is a fraud. And so instead of like using that as actual plot that's developed, that's stretched out, that expanded upon, like, oh no, what's Spider-Man going to try and do that his reputation has been defamed? How's he going to prove that he in fact didn't do? No, it's just the very next scene. The very next scene, it's undone. There's a plot line where Harry decides to force MJ into breaking up with Peter. So that happens. And so you think, oh, is this going to be like this ongoing plot line? No. Very next scene, Peter just shows up at Harry's place. Like, it's revealed immediately as a ruse. It's revealed immediately as a fabrication, as opposed to something that's developed. Why? Because it's microwave storytelling. It's having to fly through stuff because they just crammed too much in there. And that's frustrating because these aren't all bad ideas. Some of this is great material. The black symbiote suit Spider-Man, that's classic Spider-Man storyline. A lot of the imagery is very iconic. There's just not a lot of time to do it right. And what they did do with it is a little bit too corny Raimi. Well, a little bit. Who are we kidding? Way too much corny Raimi, over the top, cartoonish dance numbers. And that's what happens when you don't have time to do it right. You have to do some quick representation that's not as potentially as good as it probably should be. Likewise, all this stuff with Harry and their interpersonal stuff, potentially that could be really good. Potentially Sandman could be interesting. Potentially. But when you only get a little bit of all of it, it just pulls it all down. And I can see, like, there's some people that actually do defend this film, and I can see a bit where they're coming from, because they're not all bad ideas. And I think some of the spark is still there, but it's like microwaved leftover Sam Raimi, not fresh cooked Sam Raimi. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about Harry Osborn and the Green Goblin, or New Goblin. And this is one that's pretty frustrating. I think this is actually a really good, compelling arc of Harry loved his father, but it was a complicated relationship. Turns out that it was Spider-Man killed his father. Peter was Spider-Man. Therefore, it's the ultimate betrayal. So he's out for revenge. And there's a lot of blindness to that. He's overlooking the obvious faults in his father. And why did his father have a Green Goblin outfit? Like, what's going on here? He's blinded by all of that because of loyalty to his father. And it drives him to attack his friend. That's compelling. Even more compelling, in the finale, they team up to try and stop the real villain, the person that's taken MJ. That's even more compelling. Powerful stuff. And it makes for a very full arc for Harry, that for so long he's driven by his insecurities, his rage, turns into a villain himself, out to kill his best friend. And then by the end of it, he's redeemed. And you get to see the two of them as superheroes for just a little bit. I think that's a really great arc. The way it plays out in this movie, though, is not quite that good. It's once again, what I talked about before, because there's so many plot lines, they have to find a way to make it so that Harry doesn't spend the whole movie trying to kill Peter. So we come up with this excuse that he bonks his head and has amnesia. And so he's just acting goofy for like 30, 45 minutes. And it's this very like childish version of the character. And then he remembers that Peter is what Peter did. In which case, if you play this the timeline of the movies, if you watch Spider-Man 2 followed by Spider-Man 3, Harry learns that Peter is Spider-Man, goes to hurt him and attack him, gets injured. Then he learns that Peter is Spider-Man, goes to try and hurt him, and he gets injured. Like, it repeats the same idea because it had to delay the story a little bit to make all the pieces fit into it, to be able to spend time with Sandman, symbiote. That's what happens when you overstuff your movie and include too many villains in it, that you start repeating things and delaying things, and it hurts what is some of the prime material in here. Likewise, this one also sort of ties in with the love triangle aspect of MJ, Harry, Peter. And it certainly starts to feel a lot more contrived here, largely because you have these underdeveloped plot lines where Peter's getting an ego and getting a little full of himself, kind of getting into the stardom. And it uses that just to progress the plot line, but it doesn't do enough with it to make it interesting and compelling, really, though. It's like, kisses Gwen Stacy, and it's this thing that Peter should, of course, know, that he publicly kissed a girl hanging upside down when his girlfriend was watching, but he seems so obtuse, so clueless to that. Why is she upset? It's just strange. But the idea of Peter becoming lost in the stardom makes sense. And the idea that he would maybe not connect with her might make sense if you have time to development, where she's having a hard time and her career's not going well while he's kind of riding high. Maybe there's some interesting material in that. Maybe not. I don't know that I want a Spider-Man movie spending that much time on it like this one did, but maybe there's something interesting there. But when you don't have time to actually develop it and you're just using it to like drive plot points to like, how are we going to push MJ towards Harry? And then Harry turns evil and pushes her back and makes them break. It just feels contrived at a certain point in time. It doesn't feel organic and natural, like the progression that makes sense. And so I think if you removed kind of the Harry back and forth stuff, and you just have maybe the disconnect between Peter and MJ because of his ego and things like that, that it would work better. But when you're microwaving your storytelling, you run into some problems. Moving right along to The Sandman, and this is the one where every time I rewatch this movie, I don't really know why this plot line is in the film. it feels like they're just trying really hard to have once again another villain with a strong personal connection to Peter Parker, in which case then now we have to tie it back to Uncle Ben again in a way that doesn't add much. Whereas, you know, I have my issues with the Harry stuff, but at its core, like I think it, as much as I just complained, it pays off really nicely at the end. I think it really kind of works when he dies and they team up and everything. But with this, where you have Sandman and then they're trying to have this personal connection, it just doesn't lead to anything. They try and make him sympathetic, like he's just trying to pay medical bills for his daughter. So then what's he doing in the third act? Why is he like taking out SWAT team members and kidnapping innocent girls if all he wants to do is make money to pay for his daughter's medical bills? This will not help him do that. And so it's a character that you could like see maybe there was an idea there, but it seems like that's what Sam Raimi wanted the movie to be. Producer convinces Raimi to make it about Venom, and then Sandman is just like this extra thing that's there, retconning Uncle Ben in a way that doesn't help the story. It doesn't add any new layers to Spider-Man's origin if there was actually another person involved in the death. It doesn't add anything. And then I don't think his motivation, his arc, pays off all that well. And so I think that this was Sam Raimi trying to put the thing in he wanted while trying to do what someone else wanted. And maybe that's even the thing where this thing starts to fall apart, is that you have too many villains. You take Sandman out of it, and maybe Peter Parker can't defeat Sandman on his own. He can't beat Venom on his own, but with Green Goblin, he can. The two of them defeat Venom. Like, you can see the movie plays out is much more balanced if the first half of the movie is very much Green Goblin is the villain, and then when Venom symbiote gets in and Eddie Brock, make that more kind of the second half of the film, and then they have to team up. The movie plays better, but when you have Sandman in the mix, you waste all this screen time retconning Uncle Ben's death, having some of these sequences that just don't develop towards the payoff that you actually want. They don't add any emotion, energy in a meaningful way. And I think that kind of is somewhat where the movie got watered down, was through Sandman being in the film. And it's not that the performance was bad. You know, the effects I don't think have aged the best, but they're not even the worst effects in the film. I think he was just in the wrong movie, and he just did not in any way help this film at all. Then we got Venom and the Symbiote. Now, this is at the core of so many people's frustrations with the film because obviously Venom is a very popular character. Black Suit Spider-Man, very popular arc in the comics. And the execution here on both fronts, not good. The most embarrassing stuff in the film, Peter Parker dancing down the street saying, "Can you dig it?" Now dig on this. Trying to make MJ jealous. Embarrassing. And then the stuff that's just so disappointing, Venom finally shows up, and what do they keep doing? Making his face removed because they want you to remember it's Topher Grace. We paid for Topher Grace, so we got to show Topher Grace's face. We demanded you put Venom in the movie, but then we're going to put Topher Grace's face on it most of the time. You're like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? But I don't think the arc, the story fully flops. I think there is some merit to it because it's just good source material. So the idea of Peter Parker getting taken over by this thing at a point in time where he's a little bit lost, a little bit confused, and his ego's getting a hold of him, so he gives in to his worst desires as the symbiote inspires him in that direction, I think that works. I think there is some merit. Some people's defense of the goofy dancing stuff is that Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker has always been goofy. So what does a goofy person do when they think they're cool? They do that stuff that's totally ridiculous. I do think that is a logic that plays, makes sense. I think it's internally consistent. Doesn't mean it's good cinema. Doesn't mean it doesn't play wrong. Sometimes there's ideas that make sense in theory, but when you actually play them out and you have a guy like doing finger guns, walking down the street and doing this number. There's no way to do that that doesn't just go too far into the camp, the goof, and it pulls you out of the movie. And I think that's what kind of happens here. But at the same time, when you kind of tie it to everything else going on of a Peter Parker struggling with stuff, and he reaches this moment of he realizes how much he hates who he's become, there's something compelling to that. You don't get a ton of Spider-Man versus Venom, but you get a little bit. It is fun to see that. Would I have liked to have seen more? Yes, I would have liked it if they cut Sandman out of the movie and gave Eddie Brock Venom 20 more minutes of action. A fight between Spider-Man and Venom where Spider-Man loses, so he has to go get Green Goblin, and that leads to our final fight where the two of them team up against him. I think that would be a better version of the film that would be more focused, that knows what it's about. But I don't... it's disappointing. It's laugh out loud at times. There is some stuff in there that I do think works. And I think that's the thing about this movie. If you watch it on its own terms, if you watch it thinking through the lens of what were they trying to do, I think you can appreciate it more. And it is... maybe that's trying to convince myself that I like a film more than I do. Or maybe that's me saying, hey, I just like it because I like to spend time with Spider-Man. I like Spider-Man movies, so watching this one, it's I like these characters, I like this version, and it pays off really nicely, I think, at the end with Harry. In which case, maybe I'm more trying to be more forgiving of some things that it's tough to explain why I'm being forgiving. But I just like this world and these characters, and maybe that's where I'm coming from. Finally, let's talk about the technical aspects on here. And I don't know the backstory on it, but Danny Elfman didn't come back to score this film. And so this guy named Christopher Young replaced him. And he's been a working film composer for decades now. So he can make professional music. It doesn't sound bad. But Danny Elfman's score for the first two films was inspired. It was special. And so when you get to this movie, very early on, I was like, this just sounds more generic. It sounds like every other movie that's trying to have these moments has that type of score. And I didn't realize that Danny Elfman didn't score it. And so I was hearing the music and I went, I bet Danny Elfman didn't score this. I looked it up and Danny Elfman didn't score it. And that's a bad sign when you could just watch the movie and immediately go, someone different, not as inspired, must have scored this because this isn't what Danny Elfman would have done. That was kind of disappointing that you lost just some of the magic of the original formula with Danny Elfman directing them. Likewise, I talked about in my previous reviews how much Spider-Man 1 and 2 were groundbreaking with their visual effects and how they were able to do some of these big, gigantic, swooping action sequences or swinging action sequences through New York City in a way that you just weren't able to do really prior to the turn of the century. And so we were seeing things for like the very first time of having sequences of that size at that speed with those types of angles. We've never seen it before. This movie tries to continue that, and they do bigger things, more ambitious things, and things that I don't think have aged as well. There's a lot more full CGI characters here that are closer up. And the look and the physics aren't quite right. Likewise, they're trying to do all of these sequences where Peter Parker is battling Green Goblin and they're swinging around, and it's just doing so much kind of like swooping of the camera around them while they're falling, and he's trying to catch a ring. And then there's the one where Spider-Man's trying to catch Gwen Stacy, and he's falling from a building through debris to catch her just in time. And then likewise at the third act, that there's a skyscraper and people are falling and swinging all around. And when all of it is so grandiose, it starts to feel a lot more like you're just watching a video game. Like you want to be able to see Spider-Man swinging, but when it's just like they're falling through the air and always are able to catch something and they're going through something, that's what video game levels feel like. And it's so disconnected from reality that you don't buy into it as much. And I just feel like both on a technical CGI level as well as the nature of the sequences, they went for something too big. And even now you can do sequences like that and pull them off, but what's one of the big complaints about Black Widow that came out 6 months ago? The finale is people falling out of a sky ship, super base, landing on debris, and they're having like fight sequences while falling, and it's just detached from reality. It's just like I'm watching a very good video game cutscene or fighting a video game action sequence or something like that. And that's what this is like, except with CGI that hasn't aged the best. And so I appreciate they wanted to go try and push the boundaries, but sometimes the boundaries help you stay grounded. Sometimes the boundaries help you filter through what are good ideas and what's just doing more for more's sake. Like part of the problem is you have these sequences where they're flying all around and the camera is kind of this observer that's spinning around itself, flying all around, which it just feels, it doesn't feel like it's a real thing. It doesn't feel like you're observing from a building. It doesn't feel like you're first person or anything like that. It just feels like there's a magic camera that always can capture them. And even things like that kind of take you out of it when you feel the artificial nature of the camera, because there's no way a real camera could do that. It just pulls you out. That's what I think you feel, or at least I feel, in the action sequences in this film. And let's close out with what the movie gets right. And I think at its core, what it gets right is the vibe and the emotion. That I touched on this a little bit earlier, that you just get so invested in the characters in the first two movies that you go into this one and you want to see what's going to happen next. You want to see where all of this leads. And as much as there's faults in the execution, and there's many, as much as there's choices that are just perplexing, which there are plenty, at the same time, you're bought into the characters, and they still feel true to themselves. Even when Emo Peter Parker shows up, as goofy as it is, it doesn't feel detached from this wacky guy if he had the thing in his brain making him go cuckoo a little bit. So you can buy into the emotions of it. You can buy into the arcs, while at the same time finding 1,000 problems with the execution. And that's the strange things about films, where if you get the most important thing right, you can forgive a lot. Now, with this movie, like I said, I don't give it a positive review. I'm slightly negative on it, because it gets all sorts of stuff wrong in the execution. But it gets that emotional current right. Gets the character arc right of, I care about what happens to Peter and Harry. And so, as much as there's things that I could go very negative on it, I don't feel like I need to, because I buy into it. I can have fun with it. I can get invested in it on the most important level about the characters, while not liking dance sequences, all the singing numbers, the inclusion of too many villains, too many subplots, too much stuff going on. But I still care about the characters. Honestly, I watched the movie several weeks back and I wrote my notes, and one of the reasons it's taken me so long to post this review is I've really struggled to capture what I feel about this film and my actual take on it. Because when I wrote my notes down, it felt like it was all negative. But what did I actually feel? How much do I actually enjoy it? Well, I enjoy it, and I have more positive vibes than my words, I think, actually represent. That's an interesting feeling to have about a movie, especially as someone that reviews movies. And I don't particularly like it when I don't feel like my words can capture my thoughts and feelings properly. But that's where we're at with this film. Real quick, before I give you my final thoughts on this one, be sure to join me down below in the comment section. Let me know, what do you think about Spider-Man 3? Do you hate it? Do you love it? Are you somewhere in the middle like me, where you're kind of like, I have some fondness for it, but man, there's a lot of mistakes here. Also, I've done a ton of Spider-Man content in the past, and I got a ton of Spider-Man content coming over the next 2 weeks. You can check that out up here, or subscribe to my channel, and they'll just show up in your feed over the next couple of weeks. Overall, Spider-Man 3 is an ambitious film that captures the heart of the first two films, but I think also crumbles under its own ambitions and its attempts to do too many things. And so while I buy into the main arc between Peter and Harry, there's a lot of problems with the film overall. With that said, I'll give this one a C+ on the entertainment scale, a 6 out of 10. And if you're a Spider-Man film, of course you need to check this one out for completion's sake, but if you're not really a fan of the comic book movie genre, you can skip this one. Be sure to check out the rest of my Spider-Man content right over there, and to come back over the next couple of weeks where a whole lot more Spider-Man content will be coming. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.